So this is Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius, legal reformer, Emperor of France, and he started as a deeply unpopular child from a place nobody cared about. Corsica had just been sold to France by Genoa, which is exactly as weird as it sounds. And Napoleon's family was technically minor Corsican nobility. He gets sent to military school in France at age 9, speaks almost no French, gets bullied relentlessly, and responds by becoming obsessed with artillery. He graduates, becomes a lieutenant, and then the French Revolution happens, which is the best possible timing if you are a young, ambitious nobody. He gets his first big break at the Siege of Toulon in 1793, where he basically takes command of the artillery himself, wins the battle. He also meets Josephine around this time, falls completely head over heels, writes her borderline unhinged love letters every single day, and she is famously not that into it. They get married, and Napoleon immediately gets sent to command the French army of Italy, which is in terrible shape, underfed, and completely demoralized. And then in a genuinely absurd 17-month campaign, he defeats Austria 5 times, takes basically all of northern Italy, and forces a peace treaty. France is now very into Napoleon, which he notices immediately, and he starts thinking maybe running the whole country seems more interesting than following orders. So he decides to invade Egypt, because that'll look great on the resume. And also, because Britain controls the sea, and he can't get to Britain. The Egypt campaign goes fine, on land, and catastrophically at sea, where Admiral Nelson destroys the entire French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon hears that France is in political chaos back home, quietly abandons his entire stranded army in Egypt, sails back to Paris, and nobody really stops him. He gets back to Paris, pulls off a coup called the 18 Brumaire in November 1799, essentially pushes the government out of their chairs, and he's actually pretty good at this. He stabilizes the economy, reforms the legal system with the Napoleonic Code, builds roads, funds education. Then in 1804, he crowns himself emperor, actually takes the crown from the Pope's hands and puts it on his own head himself. The rest of Europe is watching all this with considerable alarm, and basically the whole continent forms a coalition to stop him. Napoleon responds by winning the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, which military historians still call one of the greatest tactical victories in history. At this point, Napoleon is controlling most of Western Europe and starts handing kingdoms out to his family like party favors. He also divorces Josephine because she hasn't produced an heir, despite the fact that he genuinely loves her, and Josephine is reportedly crying quite a bit. He remarries an Austrian princess named Marie-Louise, gets his heir, a son named Napoleon II, and feels pretty good about the whole dynastic empire situation. The problem is Spain, where Napoleon's brother Joseph is king, and absolutely nobody in Spain wants him there, and a brutal guerrilla war grinds on. And then Napoleon decides to invade Russia in 1812, with 600,000 men. In June, which means by the time anything happens, it will be winter. Russia refuses to fight him properly, just retreats and burns everything. So the French army marches deeper and deeper into an empty, frozen country. They reach Moscow, which Russia has set on fire, and Napoleon waits in the burning city for Tsar Alexander to surrender, and Alexander simply does not. The retreat from Moscow kills more than half his army from cold, starvation, and Cossack raids, and Napoleon arrives back in Paris with very few men. And now every country in Europe smells blood, reforms the coalition, and comes at France from every direction, and Paris falls in 1814. The coalition exiles him to Elba, a small island off Italy, and puts the old French king back, and Napoleon is now 44 years old, Emperor of Iraq. He escapes after 10 months, sails back to France, and when troops are sent to arrest him, he walks up to them alone and says, "Here I am." This is the 100 Days, his comeback arc, which lasts exactly 100 days, before Wellington and Blucher beat him at Waterloo in June 1815. This time they exile him to St. Helena, which is a tiny island in the South Atlantic, so far from everywhere that the nearest land is just ocean. He spends 6 years on St. Helena, dictates his memoirs, carefully rewrites his own legacy to sound better than it was, and does a pretty good job. He dies in 1821, officially, of stomach cancer, though people have been arguing about whether it was arsenic poisoning ever since. His body gets brought back to Paris in 1840, given a huge state funeral, and placed in a giant golden tomb at Les Invalides, and his legal code, the Napoleonic Code, still forms the basis of law in France, Belgium, Quebec, and Louisiana. So to summarize, he went from unpopular island kid to Emperor of Europe to frozen disaster to tiny island again in about 20 years. The height thing, by the way, he was 5'7", completely average for the time. The whole short Napoleon thing was British propaganda. The real Napoleon was average height, above average intelligence, spectacularly bad at knowing when to quit. So, you know, good for him, I guess.